Keep going. Don't stop. Do not stop for me. The man shouting those words has a bullet in his stomach. He does not know it yet, not fully. He knows only that something hot has passed through him and that his legs still work, and that as long as his legs still work, he is not going to lie down on this Italian hillside while 3 German machine guns cut his platoon to pieces. There is a truth about war that the men who survive it rarely say out loud. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision, made in the space of a single breath, that the man beside you matters more than the fear. On a ridge in northern Italy on the morning of April 21st, 1945, 17 days before the war in Europe would end, a 20-year-old lieutenant made that decision again and again, faster than most men make it once. His name was Daniel Ken Inouye. He was from Honolulu. He had wanted his whole life to be a surgeon, to spend his years with a scalpel in his right hand, closing wounds, not opening them. That right hand was steady now. It was wrapped around a fragmentation grenade, and in a few minutes it would be gone. But we're getting ahead of the story. The ridge was called Calle Musatello. It guarded a road junction the Germans needed and the Americans wanted, and it was defended the way the Germans defended everything in those last weeks, with men who knew the war was lost and had decided to make the Allies pay in blood for every yard of dirt. Machine guns in bunkers, mortars zeroed on the open slope, riflemen tucked into rock formations that had been there since before Rome was Rome. Inouye's company, E Company of the 2nd Battalion, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, had drawn the job of taking it. That was not an accident. The 442nd almost always drew the hard jobs. By the spring of 1945, the Army had learned something about these soldiers that it had refused, 3 years earlier, to believe. That there was no line they would not walk into, no hill they would not climb, no order they would treat as impossible. They had a phrase for it, borrowed from the gambling slang of the Hawaii plantation camps they came from. Go for broke. Bet everything. Hold nothing back. So when the machine guns opened up and the platoon went flat against the slope, 40 yards from the enemy and unable to move, Inouye did the arithmetic that officers in that regiment had trained themselves to do. If we stay here, we die here. If we go, some of us live. He went. He got to his feet under fire, and he started up the hill. He had lost something that morning. A small thing. 2 silver dollars he'd carried for luck since Hawaii, gone from his pocket somewhere on the march up. He'd noticed and felt the little cold drop in his chest that soldiers feel when a talisman disappears on the wrong day. He'd pushed it down. There was no time for omens. There were 3 machine guns and a platoon of men he was responsible for. Boys from Maui and Kauai in the streets of Honolulu. And the only luck any of them were going to get this morning was the kind you made with your own 2 hands. He crawled the last of the distance to the first gun, close enough to hear the German crew talking, close enough to smell the cordite coming off the barrel. Then he rose up and threw, and the first gun stopped. He felt the punch in his gut then, really felt it, and looked down and understood that he'd been shot some time ago and had simply been too busy to fall. He pressed a hand to his side and kept moving. This is the part the citation would record in the flat. Clean language the Army uses for things that were anything but flat and clean, with complete disregard for his personal safety. 6 words. What they mean is a man walking toward guns that are trying to kill him, bleeding, so that the men behind him would not have to. He was not thinking about medals. There would be no medal for 55 years, and the reasons for that delay are their own kind of American story, one we will come to. He was not thinking about the Senate seat he would hold, or the oath he would one day take with the wrong hand raised, because the right one would be buried in the soil of a country that was not his. He was thinking about the 2nd machine gun. Before we climb that ridge with him all the way to the end, before we get to the moment his own hand stopped belonging to him, you have to understand where he started. You have to understand that this soldier, this officer the U.S. Army was willing to send up the worst hill in Italy, had been told by that same country 3.5 years earlier that he was not fit to wear its uniform at all. To understand that, we have to go back to a Sunday morning in Honolulu, to a 17-year-old with a first aid kit and a plan to become a doctor, standing on a lawn as the sky over Pearl Harbor filled with smoke. The boy was tying a bandage when the war started. It was a Sunday early, and Daniel Inouye was 17 years old and doing what he did most Sundays, practicing. He wanted to be a surgeon. Not vaguely, not the way boys want to be firemen or ball players, but specifically with the fierce, narrow focus of a kid who has found the one thing he is sure of. He had trained himself in first aid. He had learned to wrap a wound, to splint a limb, to keep his hands calm and his voice calmer. Those hands were going to be his life. He was certain of it. He lived in the Moiliili district, a working neighborhood of Honolulu, thick with Japanese-American families like his own. His father, Hayotaro, had come from Japan as a boy. His mother, Kame, had been born in the islands. They were not wealthy. They were the kind of family that measured out its ambitions carefully and pinned them, all of them, on the children. Daniel was the oldest. He was going to be a doctor. Everyone knew it. And that Sunday morning, the radio started screaming, and he stepped out of the house and looked up, and the sky to the west was wrong. He would say decades later that he knew in that instant, before he knew the losses, before anyone did, that his life had just changed in a way he could not undo. Because the planes coming out of that smoke bore a red sun on their wings, and Daniel Inouye had a Japanese face. He didn't freeze. He ran toward the aid station, not away from it. Within hours, the 17-year-old was pressed into service as a medical volunteer, and he spent the next days doing the thing he'd trained for, except that nothing he'd trained for had prepared him for the reality of it. Civilians hit by shrapnel and by the spent American anti-aircraft rounds, falling back into the city. The burned, the broken, the dying. He worked until he couldn't stand. He used those careful hands. And somewhere in the middle of all that blood, he understood a second thing, and it sat in his chest like a stone. The men who had done this looked like him. Their faces were his father's face, his own face. He was an American, born in Honolulu, raised on the islands, no more Japanese than any boy at McKinley High was English or Portuguese or Chinese. And none of that was going to matter to the frightened country he woke up in on December 8th. He was right. Within weeks, the government reclassified young men like him. The draft designation was 4C. It meant enemy alien. It meant that Daniel Inouye, who had bled other men's blood into his own clothes trying to save them on the worst day in Hawaii's history, was now, in the eyes of his own nation, a person too dangerous to trust with a rifle. On the mainland, it got worse than a classification. In the spring of 1942, the government began rounding up families of Japanese ancestry along the West Coast. Grandmothers, infants, shopkeepers, American citizens by birth, and moving them behind barbed wire into camps in the deserts and the swamps. No charges, no trials, just the face, just the name. Tens of thousands of Americans, imprisoned by their own country for the crime of resembling the enemy. Inouye watched all of it from Hawaii, where the Japanese-American population was too large and too woven into the island's life to be locked up wholesale, but where the suspicion hung over every Nisei family like a low ceiling. He finished high school in 1942. He enrolled at the University of Hawaii and started his pre-medical studies, his hands still aimed at that surgeon's future. But something had shifted in him, and it would not shift back. He had a debt now, not to the country that had insulted him exactly, but to something larger and more stubborn than the insult, to the idea of the country, to the version of America that was supposed to be true and, in his neighborhood, in his family, mostly was. He had spent his whole life planning to heal people with his hands. Now he found himself thinking that there was more than one way to prove what you were made of, and more than one kind of wound that needed closing. He didn't have the words for it yet. He was 18. The feeling was clear, and it was this. They think we're the enemy. I am going to make them take it back. He would get his chance sooner than he expected. In February of 1943, the War Department, pressed by Nisei leaders, by the plain military logic of needing every willing man, and by a slow dawning shame, reversed itself. It announced the formation of a segregated all-Japanese American combat unit. It would be called the 402nd Regimental Combat Team. When the call for volunteers went out, Daniel Inouye put down his textbooks. He was going to be a soldier before he was a surgeon. He did not know that the war would make the choice permanent. You sure about this? They'll spend you like small change. Somebody said something like that to Daniel Inouye in the spring of 1943. A friend, an uncle, one of the older heads in the neighborhood who had lived long enough to be suspicious of a country asking young men to prove their loyalty by dying for it. It was a fair warning. It would turn out, in the coldest sense, to be accurate. Inouye volunteered anyway. So did thousands of others. When the Army asked for around 1,500 volunteers from Hawaii, Roughly 10,000 young Nisei men lined up. Think about that number. Their own government had branded them enemy aliens, had, on the mainland, locked up their relatives behind wire, and they lined up 10,000 deep to fight for it. Some of them in the camps literally volunteered from inside the barbed wire, walked out of a prison their country had built for them and into a uniform of the same country, and went to war. Inouye left Hawaii in March 1943. It was the first time in his life he had left the islands. He was funneled with the rest to Camp Shelby in the piney flatlands of Mississippi, and there the 402nd Regimental Combat Team was forged. The South in 1943 was a strange and ugly classroom for a lesson in what America was. These were soldiers in the uniform of the United States, training to die for it, and in the towns around the base they discovered they didn't fit the local map of who counted as what. The rules of the place had been built for black and white, and here came several thousand young men who were neither, wearing the flag. Inouye kept his head down and trained. He was good at it. He'd always been good at the things that required a steady hand and a cool head. And it turned out those same qualities that would have made a fine surgeon made a fine infantry NCO. The regiment took a motto. It came from the pidgin slang of the plantation camps and the gambling tables back home. Go for broke. In a dice game, it means you push in your whole stake, everything, one roll, no holding back. As a way of life, it means something harder. It means you have decided that half measures will not clear your name, that the only answer to "we don't trust you" is to give more than anyone has the right to ask, and then give more than that. They meant it. That was the thing the Army did not yet understand about the unit it had assembled almost as an afterthought. These men were not fighting only the Germans. They were fighting a verdict. Every one of them carried, folded up somewhere behind the sternum, the knowledge of a mother or a cousin or a family friend sitting in a tar paper barracks in a desert somewhere, guarded by American soldiers. You cannot shame men like that into quitting. They have already been shamed by experts, and they have decided to answer it with the only currency the doubters would respect. Inouye rose through the ranks at Shelby. He led men. He learned the grammar of the infantry, fire and movement, the way a squad flows around a strong point, the ugly close arithmetic of who goes first. He learned to keep his voice level when everything in him wanted to shout, because a scared soldier listens to a calm one and follows him, and a calm one who is secretly terrified is still worth 10 who show it. And he kept, through all of it, those surgeons' hands. He still meant to use them someday. The war was an interruption, that was all. A debt to be paid, a point to be made, and then home to Hawaii and the university and the long, clean years of medicine. He wrote to his family. He told them he was well. He did not tell them everything. In the spring of 1944, the 402nd shipped out for the Mediterranean. Their war was about to begin in earnest on the ancient contested ground of Italy, where the men who had called them enemy aliens would get their first look at what the 442nd was actually made of, and where the Germans dug in on the hills would get a lesson the Nisei had been waiting 3 years to teach. Who are these guys? That was the question moving up and down the Italian front in the summer of 1944, asked by American and German alike, and it was asked in a tone that started as skepticism and slid over a few brutal weeks into something closer to awe. The 402nd got its first real test as a full unit at a town called Belvedere on June 26, 1944. The details are the kind of thing that reads like invention, but isn't. A battalion of the regiment maneuvered against a dug-in, veteran German force, pinned it, flanked it, and took the town, and did it so decisively at so light a cost to themselves relative to the damage they inflicted, that after-action reports had a faint tone of disbelief. The unit no one had wanted to arm was, it turned out, extraordinarily dangerous. Daniel Inouye was in the thick of it. He had come to Italy a sergeant, and in the hedgerows and river valleys of the Rome-Arno campaign, he became something more than his rank. One of those soldiers other soldiers instinctively look to when the fire starts. Not because of the stripes on his sleeve, but because of the way he behaves when the stripes stop mattering. He had a gift for the worst moments. When a position broke down into chaos, he got quieter, not louder. He read ground the way he'd once planned to read anatomy. Quickly, completely, seeing the whole of it and the one place to cut. He did not think of himself as brave. Men who are actually brave rarely do. They are too aware of the fear to mistake themselves for fearless. He thought of himself as responsible. There is a difference, and it is the whole difference. A brave man might charge a gun for glory. Responsible one charges it because the alternative is watching the men he's accountable for die in the open, and he has decided he cannot live with that particular arithmetic. The 442nd pushed up the Italian boot through the summer, and the reputation grew with every mile. The Germans learned to identify them and to respect them. An irony that would not have been lost on Inouye, that the enemy across the wire granted these soldiers a professional regard their own government had withheld. And the American units fighting alongside them started to notice too. The Nisei took the hard jobs. They took the hard jobs and finished them. You could send them somewhere terrible and they went. That willingness was a double-edged thing, and Inouye was clear-eyed about it even then. A unit that never says a job is impossible is a unit that will be handed the impossible jobs. He watched friends die in the taking of ground that would have a different name on a different day and be forgotten by everyone but the families. He learned the specific weight of writing, or trying to write, the letter home about a man who wasn't coming back. He learned that the price of the point they were making, "We belong, we are Americans, take it back," was going to be counted in his friends. But he also felt the thing that the men of the 442nd would carry for the rest of their lives, the thing that made it somehow bearable. They were doing it together, and they were doing it well, and every hill they took was an argument that could not be shouted down. Every citation the regiment earned was a sentence and a rebuttal to the word enemy. They were writing it in the hardest ink there is. In the early autumn of 1944, the 402nd was pulled off the Italian line and shipped to a new front, to France, to the cold, wet mountains of the Vosges, where a disaster was waiting for someone to fix it, and where the army was about to ask the Nisei for the most expensive proof of loyalty it had, yet demanded. Inouye did not know, climbing off the transport into the French rain, that the next few weeks would nearly finish the regiment. He knew only that there was a job. There was always a job. And the 402nd went. There's a whole battalion up there, and they're already writing them off. That was the situation the 402nd walked into in the last week of October 1944, in the fog-choked forests of the Vosges Mountains in eastern France. A battalion of American soldiers, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Texas Division, had pushed too far, too fast, and been cut off, surrounded. More than 200 men dug into a wooded ridge, running low on food, water, and ammunition, with the Germans tightening around them like a fist. The papers back home would give them a name that stuck, the Lost Battalion. 2 attempts to break through to them had already failed, so the order came down to the 402nd, the unit you sent when the job looked impossible. Go get them. What followed was 6 days that the men who lived through it could never fully describe to anyone who hadn't. Vosges in late October is a miserable place to fight. Steep, dense, cold, the fog so thick that a man could lose the soldier 10 feet ahead of him. The Germans held the high ground and had zeroed their guns on every approach. There was no clever way through. There was only forward, tree by tree, ridge by ridge, into fire, and then forward again. Inouye was in it the whole way. This was the fighting around Bruyères, a town the 402nd had wrenched from the Germans on October 20th. And then the grinding push beyond it into the forest toward the trapped Texans. It was close, ugly, personal combat, the kind where you can hear the other side, where a hillside changes hands a yard at a time. The regiment did not stop. It could not stop. Somewhere ahead in the fog, 200 Americans were counting rounds and rationing water and listening, and the only sound that meant survival was the sound of the 442nd coming. They came. On October 30th, 1944, after 6 days of nearly continuous combat, the lead elements of the 402nd broke through the last German positions and reached the survivors of the Lost Battalion. 211 men walked or were carried out of that trap alive. Here is the sentence that history writes small and should write large. To rescue those 201 men, the 402nd suffered hundreds of casualties of its own. Figures commonly cited near 800. Do the terrible math. The Nisei Regiment lost and killed and wounded far more men than it saved. Rifle company that walks into the Vosges near full strength and comes out a shattered remnant is not a statistic. It is a specific list of specific young men from Hawaii and the mainland camps. And every name on it was the answer to, "We don't trust you." The rescue would become legend, one of the celebrated feats of American arms in the war. It would also raise a question that hung, unanswerable and bitter, over the men who paid for it. Were the Nisei being handed the deadliest jobs because they were the best, or because someone had decided they were expendable? Both things could be true at once. That was the cruelty of it. They were so good that they were used, and they were used so hard because, on some level, in some minds, they still didn't fully count. Inouye came out of the Vosges wounded, one of the many, and he came out of it something more than a sergeant. In the field, amid that carnage, the Army did the thing that told you everything about how far these soldiers had traveled in the estimation of the men over them. It gave Daniel Inouye a battlefield commission, a field promotion to second lieutenant, an officer. Nisei kid, who'd been branded an enemy alien 3 years earlier, now wore the bars of a United States Army officer, earned not at a school but on a freezing ridge, in blood, by common consent of the men who'd watched him lead. He did not celebrate it. You don't, not after the Vosges. He took the responsibility the way he took everything, quietly, completely, as one more thing he could not put down. He healed up. The regiment, gutted and rebuilt, rested and refilled its ranks. And then, in the early spring of 1945, with the war grinding toward its end, the 442nd was sent back to where its story had begun. Back to Italy, back to the mountains and the dug-in guns, and the last desperate German defensive line. There was one more ridge waiting for Daniel Inouye. He did not know its name yet. It was called Calle Musatello. Keep going, do not stop for me. We are back on the ridge now, back where we started, on the morning of April 21st, 1945, and this time we are going to climb it all the way to the top. He'd woken that morning and found the $2 silver gone from his pocket. Lucky pieces, carried all the way from Hawaii, through Italy and France, and back to Italy, and now, on this day of all days, lost. He'd felt the small chill of it and set it aside. The war in Europe was nearly over. Everyone knew it. There were men in that regiment doing the private arithmetic every soldier does near the end. Maybe I make it. Maybe I actually get to go home. It is the most dangerous time to be a soldier, the almost over. It is when the ground gets greedy. The 442nd, attached now to the final Allied push in Italy, had been ordered to break the Gothic Line, the last belt of German defenses in the north. E Company's piece of it was Calle Musatello, a defended ridge guarding a road junction the Germans could not afford to lose. Lieutenant Inouye's platoon led the assault. They moved well at first. Inouye directed them in a swift enveloping maneuver that overran an enemy artillery and mortar position, took prisoners, and carried the platoon to within 40 yards of the main line. And there the ridge showed its teeth. 3 machine guns, sighted in bunkers and among the rocks, opened up in interlocking fire, and 40 yards from the objective, the attack died in the open. Men went flat. Rounds came in from 3 directions at once. 40 yards is nothing, and it is everything. It is close enough to see the enemy, and far enough to die crossing it. Inouye made the decision his regiment had trained into its bones. He went. He got up under that fire and started up the slope, and somewhere in those first yards a machine gun round tore through his abdomen. He did not go down. He would say later that he simply didn't register it as a stopping wound. There was too much to do. He pressed his hand against his side and kept climbing, and he crawled the last stretch to the nearest gun until he was close enough to end it, and he came up and threw 2 grenades, and the first gun went silent. He turned to the second. He took it out with his Thompson before its crew could bring their weapon fully around. 2 guns down. His platoon, seeing the guns fall, began to move again behind him. 1 gun left. He pulled the pin on another grenade, drew back his right arm to throw. The surgeon's arm, the hand he had trained since boyhood to save lives, now cocked to take 1 more. And in that instant, a German soldier in the last position fired a rifle grenade, and it struck him full on the right arm. What happened next is the detail that makes people who hear this story go quiet. His arm was shattered, all but severed, hanging useless. But the grenade, the live grenade, pin pulled, seconds ticking, was still clenched in his right hand. The wound had locked the muscles, The fist would not open. He was staring, he said afterward, at a fist that suddenly didn't belong to me anymore. A hand that was no longer his, holding a live grenade that would kill him and the men nearest him when it went. His platoon started toward him. He ordered them back. Stay away, stay down. And then Second Lieutenant Daniel Inouye did the coldest, clearest thing of his life. With his left hand, he reached over and pried the live grenade out of his own ruined right fist, finger by finger, and he threw it into the German position, and the third gun was destroyed. Then he got up again, one arm gone, a bullet in his gut, and he stood up and kept firing his Thompson one-handed, moving on the enemy, until a burst caught him in the leg, and he tumbled down the slope he had spent the morning climbing. The ridge was taken. His men held it. When they got to him, he was still giving orders. The medics went to work. And here's a thing about Daniel Inouye that says everything about the boy who'd wanted to be a surgeon. As they carried him down off Colamusatello, more worried about him than about themselves, he was worried about them, about the platoon, about the position, about whether the line would hold. He had walked up that hill responsible for other men, and even bleeding, even ruined, he had not put the responsibility down. The right arm could not be saved. Surgeons, the men in the profession he'd meant to join, took it off. Hand that was going to spend a lifetime healing was gone, buried an ocean away from home, in the dirt of a country his family had never seen. He was 20 years old. The war in Europe ended 17 days later. He had proven, past any possible argument, exactly what the 402nd had set out 3 years earlier to prove. What his country would do with that proof, how long it would take to say the word it owed him, was another matter. That would take not 17 days, that would take 55 years. Raise your right hand. They say that to you when you take the oath of office in the United States. Raise your right hand. Daniel Inouye had heard it more than once by the time this story ends, and every single time he had raised his left, because the right one was gone, given up on a hill in Italy in a war his country had once told him he was too dangerous to fight in. But we're ahead of ourselves again. Let's take it in order, the way he lived it. He came home to a long recovery in an army hospital on the mainland, learning to live with one arm, learning to button a shirt and tie a shoe, and light a match with a hand that had spent 20 years being the other hand. The surgeon's future was over. You cannot operate with one hand. The single clearest plan of his entire life, the thing he'd been certain of since he was a boy in Moiliili, gone on the same slope as his arm. So he did what the men of the 402nd had trained themselves to do. He looked at the hand he had left, and he went for broke with it. If he could not heal bodies, he would work on the thing that had wounded his people in the first place, the law, the way a country decides who counts. He earned a law degree from George Washington University in 1952, went home to Hawaii and into politics, into the slow, patient business of representation, of turning the argument the 402nd had written in blood into something written in statute. And in 1959, when Hawaii became the 50th state, the territory that had produced 10,000 volunteers for a regiment nobody wanted sent Daniel Inouye to Washington as its first member of the United States House of Representatives. The chamber, the story goes, was asked to swear him in, and the clerk said the words, "Raise your right hand," and there was a small pause, and then the man raised his left, and the oath went on. In 1962, the people of Hawaii sent him to the United States Senate, where he would sit for half a century, one of the most respected men in the building, eventually rising to President pro tempore. Third in the line of succession to the presidency of the United States. The enemy alien, third in line. And the medal? Here is the part that should make every American sit up. For his one-arm climb up Colamusatello, Daniel Inouye was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor, not the highest. The Medal of Honor, the one his actions so plainly deserved, did not come, and he was not alone. Across the war, again and again, Nisei soldiers and other Asian American soldiers had performed acts that on any other man would have brought the Medal of Honor, and had been given something one notch lower. The pattern was not an accident. It had a name, and the name was prejudice. Took until the 1990s for the Army to go back and look honestly. A review examined the records of Asian American servicemen who'd received the Distinguished Service Cross to see how many had been denied the Medal of Honor because of their race. The answer was a great many. And so, on June 21st, 2000, 55 years after Kale Musatello, Daniel Inouye stood in the White House, a United States Senator, a grandfather, an old soldier, and President Bill Clinton placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. He was one of 22 Asian American veterans honored that day, most of them from his own 100th, 442nd, many of them receiving it after they were already in their graves. I take this as the greatest compliment I've ever had, Inouye said. I will wear it proudly and I will not tarnish it. 55 years. The man had gone off to war, a boy who wanted to heal, had left his right hand on an Italian ridge, had come home and spent his life healing the law instead, had risen nearly to the top of the government of the nation that had branded him an enemy, and only then, an old man, did that nation get round to saying the word it had owed him since he was 20. He wore it the way he'd promised. And when he died on December 17th, 2012, at the age of 88, they say his last word was a single one. The word his islands say for both hello and goodbye and love. Aloha. He is buried in the green bowl of an extinct volcano above Honolulu, the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, among the men he came home for and the men who didn't come home at all. His Medal of Honor sits in the Smithsonian now, where any American can go and look at it. Go look at it and remember what it cost and how late it came and who paid it. A boy who wanted to be a surgeon, a hand he left in Italy, a country that finally, 55 years on, raised its own hand and admitted he'd been right about it all along.